Hi, Misha here. And I've been kind of going back over some of the Soviet airplanes. And it's time for the MiG-23, so-called flogger. I have two versions as I talk about the history. Kind of funnily enough, the one over here is the most basic version, the 23MS. This one patterned after those used by Libya in the 1980s. And then over here, I have the MiG-23MLD. This is considered the ultimate fighter version, and this model is patterned after one that served in Afghanistan in the Russian Air Force. Both models are 1/72 scale diecast from Hobbymaster. And when I was getting into the Russian planes, there were some that I really knew I wanted. The MiG-15, the 21, the 25. The 23, of course I knew of, but I think like a lot of people, I kind of overlooked it, only really picking it up in the beginning to kind of complete the set. It is a bit of an unassuming plane, which is kind of a shame because this was Russia's frontline fighter throughout the 70s and really through the 80s until the MiG-29 was available in numbers. And for what it was designed to do, it was actually quite an achievement, and an economical one at that. It was considered a third-generation jet fighter, and it was Russia's first look-down, shoot-down capable, and beyond visual range capable fighter. And this whole aircraft was tied to two concepts: a variable geometry wing, a swing wing, with 3 positions, manually set, and its advanced radar and the missiles to accompany it. And now that I, got the model, I first bought this one from Pete's Collectibles a while back, and I really liked it. Immediately I liked the design, and no wonder because it, has something in common with both the F-111 and the F-14, both two aircraft that I really like, not to mention the British Tornado. In fact, I liked it so much that when this Soviet version, the MLD, was released late last year, I went ahead and picked it up too. And Hobbymaster models, while very nice, are not the cheapest in the world. Even with discount codes and whatnot, yeah. So for me to get 2, now they are different models, there are different details, and they come with different ordnance, so they are different. And they do have moving wings, and even kind of more interesting, the wings are geared together, so if you move one, they both move, and they're nice and tight, they don't flop around. And like most Hobbymaster models, you get gear up or down, cockpit open closed, pilot in or out, and you can display with or without the ordnance. And they do something on these that I really like it when they're able to do it. They give you 2 fuel tanks for the center, meaning you can display with the fuel tank on while still on the stand, or if you would rather have it on its wheels, you can use the alternative fuel tank and still have it on, or they give you a filler plug where you don't have to do either. It's your choice. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about the development and the history of Russia's flogger. The MiG-23MS here is considered a part of the first generation. There basically are two distinct fighter generations plus a ground attack series. And this all dates back to the mid-1960s. The MiG-21 was yet another successful design for the MiG Design Bureau. They had already had great success with the 15, the 17, and the 19. And this was a time before Sukhoi had really risen to prominence as they would be later. But the MiG-21 had pretty limited range, relatively limited weapons carrying ability, and was just generally a late second or early third generation fighter. So they wanted to create something based on the 21 to kind of improve upon it and modernize it. And in 1965, the Russian military set out specifications, and this new plane would need to be both for the VVS and the PVO, so basically the Russian Air Force and the Russian Defense Air Force. So it needed to be a fighter interceptor and fighter bomber. It needed to be able to have much better range and endurance than the MiG-21 and be able to carry heavier and more numerous weapons and able to mount a modern radar system. And they really wanted it to have beyond visual range abilities with its ordnance. This is a bit of a tall order for MiG at the time, and so they set out two teams in 1965. They had two ideas. One was to have a plane with lift jets for short takeoff and landing. This would become the Model 23-01. And it was pretty heavily based on the MiG-21, just upscaled. The second team would work on a swing wing, or variable geometry design, known as the Model 2311. And work would start around the same time. And throughout 1966, both design teams would be hard at work. And in 1967, the vertical lift version, it wasn't a vertical takeoff and landing, it was a short takeoff and landing, but the lift jets were there to assist in the takeoff and landing so it could operate from austere runways or short runways. Anyway, it was the first to have a prototype take to the sky on April 3rd, but the second team with the variable geometry wasn't far behind. Their prototype took to the sky on June 10th of that same year, 1967. And so the Russian military, the Russian government, would evaluate both. Both would be shown off at various air shows and demonstrations. It would be around this time NATO would give the 2301 the codename Faithless, and the 2311 the codename Flogger. And both had pros and cons. And, well, it's often stated that the lift jet version, once the jets were used for takeoff, they were pretty much just dead weight that impacted performance, which is absolutely true. The swing wing version wasn't without some detractions in itself. The swing wing mechanism of that day was quite heavy and bulky. So they both, because they needed to have the vertical takeoff and landing ability, or not vertical, sorry, short takeoff and landing ability, they had to have some extra material. Plus, again, they needed the range, so fuel and all that good stuff. That said, from quite early on, while the 2301 was an interesting concept, it was the 2311 that was kind of always felt to be pulling ahead. With that, by December of 1967, the government would order progress on the 11, and the 01 was pretty much abandoned. 6 more prototypes would be made, and these would be flown quite a bit, nearly 100 test flights throughout 1968, and the process was quite smooth. To that end, the first pre-production model, I hesitate to call it a production model, but the first pre-production model flew in May of 1969, known as the MiG-23. It was unarmed. It did have a new wing from the original prototype. This would be the Flogger A in NATO. And from there, production would ramp up. This would enter into service in 1971 and would start to become available in numbers, both for the Russian VVS and PVO, as well as be made available for export to friendly nations. So by the mid-70s, the new MiG started to take to the skies, and it was hoped it would supersede the MiG-21 and even some MiG-17s and 19s still in service. However, things did not quite work out that way. I'll move the wings for you. And talking about design, that's as good a place to start as any. This is built around the swing wing, the variable geometry concept. The position was to be set manually by the pilot. It wasn't automated. And this obviously did take inspiration from the F-111. But whereas that was pretty much a dedicated interdictor, the Russians wanted to make the MiG still able to be a dogfighter. So it needed to have speed and agility. Essentially, when the wings were fully forward at about 16 degrees, this was for takeoff and landing and kind of low speed attack and low speed cruising. When you moved them in the middle position, about 45 degrees, this was for basic fighter cruising. Also a low-level interception. Just, kind of a midpoint. And when they were swept all the way back, about 72 degrees, this was for high altitude interception, or what were considered low altitude dashes, like to run in and strike and then get back out. So everything's a compromise. This is a single engine. It's a very large, powerful engine. Single seat. Overall length is just shy of 55 feet. And with the wing geometry, the width, wingspan is a little shy of 46 feet all the way out, or 26 feet in. Had a quite impressive maximum speed of Mach 2.35 at altitude, or Mach 1.2 at sea level, and it could climb up past 60,000 feet. Had 6 hard points, 2 on the center line, 2 fuselage, 2 glove mounted, and it could carry about 6,600 pounds of ordnance. So again, a great improvement over the MiG-21. You would have first 3 and then soon 4 internal fuel tanks, and could carry up to 4 external fuel tanks. And to finish things out, it had one 23mm double barrel cannon with between 200 and 250 rounds. And again, this was designed around a new advanced radar, the Sapphire, or Sapphire. But the initial production, or really pre-production model, the 23S, the radar wasn't ready yet, so it had to be fitted with an older radar from the MiG-23MS, meaning that the first version was actually not beyond visual range capable. But they only made about 60 of them, and they basically just used them for training and refinement. Same goes for the second one. That was the MiG-23SM. It had some improvements, some engine upgrades, some weapons changes, but again, the radar wasn't quite ready yet, so it entered into the pre-production more than anything. And these would be the Flogger A's. It was the MiG-23M, first test flown in June of 1972, and quickly put into production. It was the first to have the new Sapphire radar, and thus able to use the more modernized ordnance. And this would be the first real production model, known to the West as the Flogger B. Now, there were several variations. Russia used the 23M, a version made for friendly Warsaw Pact nations. Allied nations was known as the 23MF. It was nearly as advanced as the 23M, just had some few changes for their COMBLOC allies. And for export, they had the 23MS, this one here, which had a much downgraded radar, and to some extent weapons and other avionics, because Russia considered that technology too critical to just let go. Actually, as it turns out, that wasn't a bad decision considering what would soon happen. But anyway, there was the downgraded version. It is worth pointing out that the nations that bought these were mostly from North Africa and the Middle East. Some early users were Syria and Egypt. Also, this one here, Libya received their first Floggers in 1974. They would get 54 single-seaters. They would also get 50 others. Ultimately, they would have 170 in service. Egypt would only get about 20, because it wasn't long after that the Egyptian government fell out with the Russian government. And actually what had ended up happening, Egypt, getting closer to the West, would work a deal for technology exchange, and they would provide the West with some of their 23 Floggers, and America would use them for training, designating them as the YF-113, so F-113. But Syria would continue to fly theirs. They used them against Israel. And Libya, though they would store most of them, they would keep around 24 flying. And these would actually be involved in the second Gulf of Sidra incident, where American jets would shoot down a couple of Libyan MiG-23s. But anyway, so these saw quite a bit of use in North Africa and the Middle East throughout the 70s and 80s. China even acquired a couple from Egypt and studied their technology. On the Chinese aircraft videos I've done in the past, I mentioned that the MiG-23 had some influence on some Chinese designs. They never directly copied it, but it definitely influenced. And of course, several Eastern European nations like Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and Poland, as well as Romania and Hungary, would have some MiG-23s. But even with the 23M, with the Flogger B, the newer production models, the plane did not quite replace the MiG-21 as Russia had hoped. It turned out to be, while a better performer, also more maintenance intensive and just more technologically demanding. So in the end, it ended up being Russia that would use the most of these. And this would be the backbone, primarily being used as a fighter, but would have a secondary role as a ground attack aircraft, which is where its involvement in Afghanistan and eventually these newer models would come into play. Before we move on from the Libyan example of the 23MS here, interestingly, these were flown against Egyptian MiGs in the late 70s during their war, and at least one was shot down by MiG-21. And this MiG-21 had been upgraded with American or Western technology, specifically AIM-9 sidewinders. While the MiG-23 had a lot of improvements over the 21, it was not as small and maneuverable. And so, along with the superior American missile, the Egyptian pilot shot down a Libyan 23. Now keep in mind that this was the MS version, so it could not take full advantage of the plane's attributes. In this version, the MF and the NS, NATO called the Flogger E. But in Russia, the 23M with full radar and weapons was getting into service. In 1974, they introduced an option for a new double pylon, so 2 weapons could be carried instead of 1 on the same station. And they started work on various versions. Now, the Flogger C was the 23U and then soon UB, the 2-seat trainer, although it was had limited weapons capability. And of course, there were all the ground attack versions. There's the 23B, the first dedicated ground attack version, which was tested in 1970. It quickly gave way to the 23BK and 23BN, which actually were exported in quite decent numbers. And they were very similar aircraft. They had a simplified engine, they were armored, the nose was reworked for ground targeting, but in a lot of ways. And it would actually be the 23BM that would lead to the MiG-27 variant. But that's a story for another day, because I don't have a model of a 27M. Maybe one day I will. This version here, though, began testing in 1976. And by 1978-79, the 23ML was in production. And the ML has a whole laundry list of upgrades. You can read about those. It had, of course, a newer version of the Sapphire radar. It had an improved, upgraded engine. It had more access to weaponry. The The L in the name basically stood for lightweight. They were able to skim quite a bit of weight off the airframe, trying to give it more maneuverability, even though that had not been a large priority at the beginning. After experience, they decided they wanted a little more of that, so they shaved some weight off. They actually ended up removing one of the fuel tanks to save some weight. All kinds of interesting things. And this would be the Flogger G. And the ML would give way to the MLD around 1982, which was just a further development with several aerodynamic improvements. And again, weapons access and guidance. And this would be the most common version used in Afghanistan by Russia. Now, interestingly, the Russian Air Force did not get all new airframe MiG-23MLDs. They actually had their older 23Ms and 23MLs updated to the MLD standard. This was because by this time, 1982-83, the MiG-29 was on the horizon, not to mention the Sukhoi Su-27 and all of that. So they just sent in their planes for upgrade, but over 560 were upgraded. And for export customers, there was a version known as the 23MF, and these were brand new airframes. And the NATO name would end up being Flogger K for these last versions. And the last one came off the production line in December of 1984. The 23BN, the ground attack variant, actually had a very protracted run, not ending until the same time. Some sources say 1984, some say 1985. Regardless, it was in production for well over a decade, and they built over 600 of those. Some used by Russia, some exported. And the 23MLD in Afghanistan was used for ground attack. It was also used as a fighter. It went up against F-16s piloted by the Pakistani Air Force. And there's claims and counterclaims of who shot who down or who didn't do something. But yeah. And probably one of the most important final developments, newer versions were able to use the short-range Archer missile, which proved to be an excellent missile for Russia. So a typical combat loadout would be 2 medium-range missiles and 4 short-range. Alternatively, it could carry 2 gun pods, rocket pods, guided and unguided bombs. The Flogger could even carry nuclear ordnance, at least the Russian, the Soviet versions. The exports, not so much. And for the PVO, the Air Defense Force, a special air interception version known as the MiG-23P, also codenamed Flogger G, was fielded. And they would have over 500 of those. Quite a prominent plane. And by 1990-1991, around 1,500 were in Russian service in all branches. Another important user was Iraq. Saddam Hussein's government began acquiring these in the early 80s. Both the 23MF variants and 23ML, I was thinking of other things, sorry, it's late. 23BN ground attack variants, as well as the 23 UB trainers in small numbers. He had quite an impressive fleet, well over 100. I think he had around 120 to 130 one time. And these were flown both in the ground attack ability and the fighter role against Iran. When going up against some older planes like the F-4, they did quite well, but when Iran put their F-14 Tomcats against them, not so much. The Tomcat pretty much dominated it, although there were a couple of claims that they were shot down a few, but yeah, it's kind of hard to substantiate that kind of stuff. Let's just say it was there. And while Saddam was quite impressed with some of his aircraft, like the Su-25 Frogfoot, the MiG-23 was frankly a bit of a disappointment to Iraq. It didn't do what they needed to do, and again, it didn't help that their adversary was flying one of the best American aircraft. Nevertheless, these are still in service in 1990 in August when Saddam Hussein decided to invade Kuwait. These were used in their strike abilities. But then, then during the Gulf War in 1991 in January and February, Saddam found that his MiG-23 fleet was cut in half. They lost a lot of them. Some fled to Iran for sanctuary. Many were destroyed on the ground. A few, 6 or 8, were shot down by American fighters in the air. They had no air victories. At least the Iraqi MiG-25 did have the Hornet kill. The MiG-23 had nothing. So after the war, Saddam found himself with only about 60 left, and a couple of these were shot down during the whole no-fly zone in the early 90s. So by the time of the Second Iraq War in 2003, the MiG-23s were left on the ground and never would fly for Iraq again. They would be essentially just retired after that. In Russia, after the end of communism, a decision was taken to kind of scale back some of the armed forces, and the MiG-23 was one of those on the chopping block. Throughout the 90s, they were scaled back. And the last version to really be flown was the MiG-23P and the PVO, and it was officially retired on May 1st, May Day, of 1998. And other Eastern European nations had retired their own MiG-23s between roughly 1996 and 2004. Interestingly, Libya would still have some and still be flying some in 2011 during the Civil War. In fact, both sides had some MiG-23s. They were still flying back then, even though they were not in the best repair and were quickly becoming antiques. It's one of the last few places I can find that really flew these. In total, over 5,000 would be built, making the aircraft the most produced swing-wing fighter in Russia, not to mention their first swing-wing fighter. And unlike a lot of Western airplane projects, it was relatively quick to develop and relatively inexpensive to mass produce, so there has to be something said for that. And it did achieve the goals it was set out for. It was superior to the MiG-21 in the ways they wanted, and it was a very effective ground attack aircraft, fighter bomber, and a decent fighter besides it just kind of had the misfortune of coming along at the same time as Western aircraft, such as the F-15. I mean, so, what can you do? And then, of course, itself was supplanted by the MiG-29 in the 1980s. So it is kind of often overlooked. As I said at the beginning, even I kind of overlooked it. I knew it existed, but it was just kind of another Soviet plane. But it really is neat. You just don't see many designs like this. And like a lot of Soviet planes, it was simple, robust, and durable. As for the Hobbymaster models, kind of as I said at the beginning, not many model makers, die-cast model makers at least, do a flogger. And Hobbymaster is definitely the most prevalent. They do a couple of different Russian ones. They do the Libyan one, of course. They do, I know they do a couple of Czechoslovakian ones. They have a few different styles. They have an MF, and I believe they have an ML coming out. Minor things. And there are lots of little changes between the originals and whatnot, the generations. If you notice on the in front of the tail, the vertical stabilizer, there's a ridge. Maybe. On the MLD, that was deleted as part of the changes. It also has the different radar housing below, because the MS would have had the simplified one. And of course this has different ordnance, including the double pylons for the Archer in front. And it has the tank you can display on or off. Because of how slim this is, it's one of their lighter models. The main body is metal, but the wings are actually polymer, which, considering how thin they are and the fact that they have to move, I understand. I think if these were made of metal, they might be a little too easily bent, and they would be very hard to put the panel lines in and look good. So it just is what it is. The tail is polymer as well. And of course the engine nozzle. But that's acceptable. I mean, there's just some models, if you want them to look right, you kind of have to do that. If you want chunky metal, get one of their Sukhois. Those things are all metal. Or even their MiG-25, which I have done a video on. Interestingly, though this has a lower name, it's kind of neat to see how the MiG-25 and the MiG-23 were nearly developed concurrently, although the MiG-25 kind of predates it slightly. But the MiG-25 was a high-speed, high-altitude interceptor, interdictor. It was not a dogfighter. So for the 23, they wanted something that was capable of dogfighting. And they got it. It was definitely more so than the 25. Now, of course, that's why the MiG-29 would replace it. It would become the light tactical fighter, leaving the Sukhoi, first the 27 and the 30, to be kind of the large, long-range replacements for the MiG-25. But I'm sure I'll cover those again. I actually have a new Sukhoi model, so probably get to that pretty soon. Yeah, like I said, the wings move on these, and they're very stable, which I like. Well, I guess that's enough for tonight. I hope you enjoyed hanging out and talking about Russian planes. Any comments, please do post them below. And as always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I will catch you very soon next time.